Right, I propose we start. Welcome everyone. I'm going to share my screen with you to welcome you to this webinar series, this new webinar series. Let me just see how I get this. To this new webinar series, The Value of Water in Canada. My name is Brouwer. This is a webinar series that I'm organizing together with my counterpart, Pat Lloyd-Smith, at the University of Saskatchewan. And we're working together in global water futures, where the value and the valuation of water resources is a prominent research line. Before I start the webinar and explain to you what the webinar will look like in the coming months, I would like to start by acknowledging that I'm participating today from traditional territories of the First Peoples here. And here in the Waterloo region, I'm on the Abatement tract, land that was promised to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River. And here you see a map of the land. The Abatement tract is within the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. And as you can see from the map, there is a discrepancy between what was granted and where the original inhabitants of this area live, and what remained as part of the agreement. The reserve is on approximately 19,000 hectares of land, whereas the original size of the land was almost 400,000 hectares. And I encourage you to take a moment to recognize the traditional land where you are. So back to the webinar series. The setup is as follows: that we have a 30 minutes, 35 minutes presentation followed by Q&A. If you have questions, please use the Q&A box that you can see on your screen to submit your questions. And then today's session will be moderated by myself. That will be a challenge, but I'll get to your questions then at the end of the presentation. Please just use the Q&A and not the chat box. I'm joined here with my colleagues from the Water Institute, Julie Grant, Marianne Hardy. They will help me with getting to these questions at the end. Here is an overview of the program that we put together so far for 2022. I'll kick off this morning, and then in the coming months, every second Wednesday, I believe it is, of every month, we'll have another webinar by another person, a nice combination, I hope, of academics, people from the private sector, the public sector, different parts of the country, end users, practitioners, all interested in the value of water, how we best capture the value of water, what the methodologies are that we're using to value water, and what the uptake is of these values in actual policy and decision making, and how useful these values are in policy and decision making. So we will have a couple of people in the webinar series that are going to talk about, in particular, economic valuation methods. That it includes the presentation that I'm going to give here today. We also have critical voices of economic monetary valuation in our series, and we have alternative voices like Laurie Bradford, for example, addressing other important social and cultural values of water. Those of you who are participating and who are interested in making a contribution to this new webinar series, please contact me. I'm sure you are able to find my email. It's also at the end of my presentation, and let me know if we can continue this webinar series, maybe even into 2023. So having said all that, today's presentation is a kickoff of and is aiming to give an overview of the work that we're doing in global water futures about the valuation of Canada's water resources. And on this first slide, I'm indicating that I'm not doing this on my own here at the University of Waterloo in the Water Institute. I have a number of colleagues that work with me on this. Economists and non-economists from different departments and schools and research groups here at the University of Waterloo. And our main objectives are indicated here. What we are aiming for is to connect these economic values to the biophysical qualities of water, the ecosystem services that these waters provide, and properly value these ecosystem services in economic terms. In the presentation today, I'm going to focus very specifically on the reliability of existing values for water quality improvements, and how they can help to inform policy and decision making at different levels. And this work is very closely related to the work that we're doing to operationalize Environment Climate Change Canada's water quality evaluation model, that I will talk about a little bit too in this presentation. This is the outline of the presentation. I'm going to talk about a study that was published at the end of last year, and then the results of that study are going to be integrated in this water quality evaluation model, WQVM, and we're applying it here to the Great Lakes where we live and work. And I'll end with some conclusions, challenges, and next steps. So Canadians are, generally speaking, fairly relaxed when it comes to water. And this is a copy from the RBC report on public water attitudes. It's a study, a survey that the RBC was committed to over 10 years, from 2007, 2008 until 2017. These are the results from the last survey that they conducted in 2017, and where you can see that many Canadians associate with water. They think that water is an important part of Canada's national identity. More than half of the population is of this belief. A lot of people believe that Canada is a water abundant country. It obviously is, and a limited number of people, it's these dark blue colors here, believe that Canada is at risk of a fresh water quality problem, or at risk of fresh water supply shortages in the future. So the question is, are Canadians too relaxed perhaps about water? The quote that I have here at the top is taken from the survey, from the study. Many Canadians take water for granted. We measure water in a wide variety of ways. This is an example for the Great Lakes, where the value of water is related to its role in the regional economy, for example, the role it plays in recreation, tourism. We obviously use it for drinking water, and there are jobs associated with this blue economy. We're doing a lot of work here in global water futures and here at the University of Waterloo, where we are trying to assess the possible restriction of future water supply as a result of climate change, but perhaps also because of the deterioration of water and its quality for different economic activities. And here is an example of a study that we conducted, where we looked at the impact of climate change in the Great Lakes Basin, and how that would impact possibly water availability in the future. We calculated through the economic impacts, the direct and indirect economic impacts of two scenarios, scenario A and scenario B, where we increase water stress as a result of climate change, existing climate change scenarios for the region, and assessed what the implications would be for the Great Lakes economy and for the province of Ontario as a whole. And so on the vertical axis here on the right-hand side, you see the percentage points reductions in GDP of the province of Ontario. And it's just a couple of percentage points reduction in GDP as a result of a reduction in water availability in the Great Lakes Basin. But keep in mind that annual GDP in Ontario is around 750 billion Canadian dollars. So just a 1% point reduction in that GDP is 7.5 billion Canadian dollars per year. So these costs of water scarcity can increase quite rapidly, especially here under scenario B, where we also impose food and energy security as an additional constraint on the limited water that is available for economic activities in the future. And we were able to spell it out for these different other, for the different lakes making up the Great Lakes Basin here on the Canadian side. We do this the same elsewhere in Canada as part of Global Water Futures. So similar models have been developed for the Saskatchewan River Basin that you see here on the left-hand side, the SRB, and we're making use of the same modeling framework and the same data from Statistics Canada to develop these multi-regional, multi-sectoral models that allow us to look at both the direct and the indirect impacts of increasing water scarcity in Canada, be it as a result of climate change, be it as a result of the deterioration of water quality, or socioeconomic development in certain areas. The social costs of water pollution can be considerable. This is a result from a study conducted in 2017 by the International Institute for Sustainable Development, where they looked at the cost of environmental pollution in Canada more generally, and they came up with a value of around 143 million Canadian dollars annually for fresh water pollution across the entire country, taking into account, for example, lost recreational opportunities. They also looked very specifically at harmful algal blooms in Lake Erie and came up with very high numbers for social costs there as well. A study conducted a few years later by Rod Smith, who's also part of this webinar series, looked very specifically at the Canadian side of Lake Erie and the social damage costs of eutrophication on different types of activities and income generating activities in the Canadian part of Lake Erie. And he came up with a economic damage value of 270 Canadian dollars under a business as usual scenario, just for the Canadian side of one of the lakes, Lake Erie. So substantial social costs of water pollution and substantial economic costs also if we want to avoid that pollution. This is an example of another study conducted here with my colleague George Garcia and Ruth Pinto, where we developed a macroeconomic model again for the Great Lakes economy, where we looked at the impact of reducing total phosphorus here on the horizontal axis, going into the different Great Lakes. This is the picture for the entire Great Lakes Basin. And if we want to reduce total phosphorus, that will have quite big implications for both the direct costs on the economic activities that are emitting these flows of phosphorus into the Great Lakes, but there will also be very important indirect effects, spin-off effects, both in the Great Lakes Basin, in the province of Ontario, and for Canada as a whole, given the role of the Ontario economy in Canada. So if we want to reduce, for example, total phosphorus by 40%, as is currently the policy target in the Western Basin of Lake Erie, you just draw a vertical line through this point here, you go all the way up here, and then you go to the left, for example, or to the right, you see here percentage point reductions of GDP, in this case of Canadian GDP, so not province of Ontario, but the entire country. And the percentage points are even smaller here than what I showed you before for water scarcity. But keep in mind that GDP in Canada is around 2.2 trillion Canadian dollars on an annual basis. So if we want to reduce total phosphorus by 40%, you go to the left, for example, you end up with an annual cost of around 3 billion Canadian dollars every year to prevent these social costs of eutrophication, for example, that I showed you before. And the question is, are we willing to pay for these investments into improving water quality? How do we measure the benefits of water quality improvements in economic terms? What we do is we look at how these water quality improvements affect the different uses associated with the water, also referred to as ecosystem services. And then a question in economics is, how much are we willing to pay for increasing the availability or the quality of these services? The way these services have been used in the past, over the past decades, is best illustrated with this water quality ladder developed by Resources for the Future in the 1980s, where different water quality levels were linked to different water uses: boating, fishing, swimming, and drinking. And that idea of making or of improving water quality for these different uses is also part of, for example, the Great Lakes strategy here in Ontario, where the vision of the province is one of healthy Great Lakes for a stronger Ontario, with lakes that are drinkable, swimmable, and fishable. So a very important way of communicating, but also measuring the improvements in water quality in terms of the way it affects possible water uses, and what we're willing to pay for it. And that idea of quantifying the benefits of water quality improvements, which is not always very easy, because everyone is using the water, and it's a public good, as we say in economics. That was integrated in a development of this pioneering water quality valuation model that I was referring to at the beginning, by Diane Dupont and Steve Renzetti, in collaboration with Environment Climate Change Canada, where they try to link available water quality monitoring data to the water quality ladder, and the different levels on that level of boatable, fishable, swimmable, drinkable water quality, and then link it to public willingness to pay for improving water quality by moving up that ladder from boatable to fishable, swimmable, drinkable water quality. And at the time of the development of that water quality valuation model, they made use of the available data for public willingness to pay in Canada, and a lot of those values were borrowed from the South, from the US, and different approaches were also introduced in the model to look either at average values or transposing or transferring an entire value function. And that function was based on the work of Rob Johnston in the US and his colleague Thomasine. And just to illustrate to you how that value function looked like, that was used in the original version of the water quality valuation model, that is shown here. So Rob and his colleague estimated two models, one just for the US, and then another model that included Canada as well, by including a limited number of Canadian value estimates for willingness to pay in their value function as well. And so the difference is 16, as you can see. So for the US model, they had 81 observations. For the Canadian model, they had 97 observations. So 16 Canadian values were included, and they included control for that by including a dummy variable for Canada, for Canadian public willingness to pay. And you can see from the sign of the coefficient here that Canadians are on average significantly less willing to pay for water quality improvements than the Americans. They also try to control for baseline water quality levels, both in the US and in Canada. And you see that there is a positive coefficient here, which means that Canadians are willing to pay more for water quality improvements if baseline water quality is higher. And it deviates there from the results from the US, where the opposite result was found. If water quality is bad, people are willing to pay more to improve it. They found that these values increased over time. There is a significant negative effect of the year index, the time trend. So studies that were carried out earlier generated significantly lower values than studies that were carried out more recently. They tried to control for income, but didn't find a significant income effect. We expect a positive income constrained. What we're willing to pay is constrained by what we're able to pay. They found that there was a negative effect of the use of the water quality ladder. So if you use that kind of ladder that I showed you before, that was developed originally for resources for the future, then that significantly often reduces the values that we get out of these valuation studies. Unfortunately, this was not significant in the regression model that Johnston estimated. They included control for the different water body types that these valuation studies looked at: lakes, estuaries, salt ponds, a combination of different regional freshwaters, and some of them had a statistically significant effect. So lakes resulted compared to rivers to higher willingness to pay values. For example, non-users of the water were willing to pay less. That's the negative sign here than users of the water. And here is where they introduced the water quality ladder. What they did was they interacted the water quality index that underlies the water quality ladder with who benefits from these water quality improvements. So is it fish species? Is it shellfish species? Is it many different types of species? Or are the species non-specified in the underlying valuation study? And that then has a significant positive effect no matter what the beneficiary is of the water quality improvement. So if you improve water quality, the water quality index goes up, and water quality improves, then public willingness to pay increases. So this pioneering work on the water quality evaluation model led to a pilot version of the model that was reviewed by myself and my colleague here in 2018 as part of Global Water Futures, and we came up with a number of challenges and recommendations to further operationalize this model. And what I'm going to focus on in this talk is especially the latter part on the quantification of the benefits and the way we can improve on the values that were originally included in the water quality evaluation model. And so the way we did this was in two ways. We looked at Canadian water quality evaluation studies, and we also did a survey, and I'll come back to that second part later. So let me start with the review of the Canadian literature. So as I mentioned, Johnson and Thomasin mainly based themselves in their value function on Canadian willingness to pay values. A number of Canadian values were included as well, 16. These were extracted from 2 Canadian studies. We added 20 new studies to that valuation function, 20 Canadian water quality evaluation studies, and 5 of those studies related directly to the water quality ladder that I just showed you as well. So from these 22 studies in total, we extracted 59 willingness to pay values. So we went from 16 to 59 willingness to pay values, and we try to explore what drives these willingness to pay values, what determines their size. This is an overview of where these different Canadian studies were conducted and over which time period. You can see most of them are found at the southern border of the country, where most people obviously live and where most pressures are found also on Canada's water resources. The studies were conducted in, I think, 6 out of the 10 provinces, and they were based on a total of 12,000 people that were surveyed in these different studies altogether over a period of around 30 years. And in green, you see the different drainage basins in which these studies were carried out. And the work that I'm presenting here it was published, as I said, at the end of last year in Canadian Water Resources Journal. So you can look up the details of the study there. What we managed to do was to derive these willingness to pay, average willingness to pay values from these different studies using that water quality ladder from boatable, fishable, swimmable to drinkable. And what we found was that willingness to pay for higher water quality level improvements increased consequently. And what we see is, if we just look at the mean values, these are the error bars, these are the standard errors of the mean willingness to pay values, public willingness to pay values that we found. What you see is that it increases, but it increases in a diminishing way. So it levels up, the willingness to pay levels up, which in economic terms would reflect something that we refer to as diminishing marginal utility, as the quality of the water is increased. So these were the average values that we found from these 22 studies, these 59 willingness to pay values. And what we were particularly interested in was explaining where these willingness to pay values came from. And for that, we estimated a similar model like the one that I showed you before from Rob Johnston, where we included a bunch of characteristics related to the study design, the population of beneficiaries, the characteristics of the water resources that were valued. And I'm just showing you here a snapshot of the full models that we estimated in the paper, except for this reduced form model that we use for benefits transfer purposes. But I'm not showing you all the different study characteristics that were included to see how they affect the willingness to pay values. So I'll just very briefly talk you through the results here. So we have this reduced form model that we can use for benefits transfer. We have this full model where the coefficients are slightly different compared to the reduced form model, because we converted everything in log form to get a better fit. At the bottom, you see the number of observations, these 59 willingness to pay values that were extracted from these 22 studies. We find, just like Johnston, a significant negative time trend. So the value of water increases in Canada over time. We've found that there is a significant difference if we control for a bunch of other influencing factors between what people are being asked to pay to improve water quality versus what people are willing to pay to prevent a further deterioration of water quality. So these are two distinct welfare measures in economic theory, and the fact that willingness to pay to prevent further deterioration is higher than willingness to pay for improvement levels has to do with loss aversion in people, among others. We looked at population characteristics. So population density was expected and is significant in explaining willingness to pay. If there is a higher population density, there's a higher demand for the water services involved, and so public willingness to pay is expected to go up. And as I mentioned, household income is expected to significantly constrain willingness to pay as well. We find, just like Johnston and Thomasine, a negative sign for household income in the reduced form model, and it's significant in our case. But if we include other influencing factors, we get the expected positive sign, where willingness to pay increases as people have more income to spend. Non-users are, just like in Johnston, less willing to pay than users. And we included, for example, water body size as a control variable in the full model, has a negative sign. So that again reflects diminishing marginal utility. We control for the baseline water quality levels, and we find, just like Johnston, that this has a significant positive effect. So if the water quality is high already, people are willing to pay more than when water quality would be lower. And if we start improving water quality, so change the water quality index, that has a significant positive effect. In the reduced model, we merged all the different types of water bodies. In the full model, we made a distinction between rivers, lakes, aquifers, entire watershed. And you see that there are significant positive coefficients here, but the differences between these coefficients are not statistically significant, which means that willingness to pay for a river and an aquifer, for example, is not significantly different once we start including control for other influencing factors as well. And lake is not significant here at all. Interesting other finding is that if we interact in this reduced model, the baseline water quality level with the change in the water quality, we find is a significant negative effect. So here in this reduced model, where we pool all the different water bodies don't make a distinction between rivers, lakes, and aquifers, for example, what we find is that the change in water quality is less, or willingness to pay for that change in water quality improvement is less if the baseline water quality is lower. So based on these valuation functions, we tested how well they predict our willingness to pay values. And here you see the results for both the original value function and the new one that we generated, making a distinction between the reduced form and the full model that I just showed you. And you can see that the mean unit value transfer goes down from 74% to 24% if we just use Canadian studies. And the results are very are better also if we use a function transfer instead of this average value transfer. So what this means is that if we predict Canadian values based on a value function that includes US studies, we get a higher prediction error than if we use a value function that only includes Canadian studies to predict the change in water quality and public willingness to pay based on Canadian valuation studies only, as expected. Yeah, so an improvement in the predictive power. And to illustrate what difference it makes, we applied this new value function to the Great Lakes. We also did some other things in the water quality valuation model, namely moving from federal monitoring stations that you see here on the right-hand side, and these black triangles, there are only a few of them in the Great Lakes Basin. So we moved to the provincial water quality monitoring network. We took the average water quality levels between 2017 and 2020, and then applied this Canadian value transfer function, as I said. What we looked at was a change in the baseline water quality levels overall for the different lakes, and try to predict public willingness to pay for a reduction of 40% in this case for nutrients, total phosphorus, total nitrogen, and turbidity. That would improve the water quality levels and would move the boatable water quality level in Lake Erie, for example, to fishable water quality in Huron and Ontario to swimmable, and make Lake Superior, which has a good baseline level already, even better to drinkable water quality. And so what are the value estimates that we get out of the water quality valuation model if we would use the original value function versus the new Canadian value function? And that is depicted in this overview. So here on the right hand side, you see once again what I showed you in the previous slide, the changes from the baseline to the policy targets, and then the old values based on the US Canada value function, and then in red the new values based on the Canadian value function. In most cases, you see that the values go down quite substantially, even in some cases, and only in the case of Lake Erie, we get a value that is much higher than the value that we would have gotten if we would have applied the old value function. Yeah, so fairly big differences in the unit values, in the dollars per household per year, for these water quality improvements. I'm not looking here at the total economic value. I'm going to assume that the total economic value calculation is the same irrespective of the underlying valuation function. It's just adding up these unit values over the number of households, the population that benefits from these changes, and that aggregation procedure will not differ depending on the valuation function that we have. So what we see here are substantial differences in the unit values that we find for the different lakes that provide the basis for that aggregation procedure. Moving to the second test procedure, where we use primary data based on the survey that we did in the Great Lakes to see how different the values would be if we would use the new Canadian value function and use actual survey data, primary survey data for the Great Lakes. This is a study that I already presented before. It's a study that we did in collaboration with Diane Dupont. It was web-based. We did it in the winter of 2019, just before the pandemic. And then in the summer of 2020, we did a follow-up survey, exactly the same survey again. It was called a retest in economics. This is the survey design that we used. And if you're interested in this survey, please go to this YouTube video. I don't have the time to go through all the details here with you, but it was a thoroughly pre-tested survey following state-of-the-art guidelines for conducting valuation research. This is a map showing you where the people lived that were part of the survey in the original one in the winter of 2019, and then here the second number refers to the number of respondents in the follow-up survey in the summer of 2020. A lot of dark blue, obviously, where there are cities where a lot of people live. So it's a representative sample based on population density within the Great Lakes, both on the Canadian and the US side. Here are some summary stats. On average, people live 90 kilometers away from the nearest lake. In Canada, in the US, it was slightly closer, almost 60 kilometers, and around 7% of the respondents were owner of a lake cottage. In the survey, we did a so-called choice experiment, so a way of eliciting public willingness to pay by using these maps and taking into account very explicitly potential substitution effects and showing people a reference situation and possible futures for the Great Lakes by moving up this water quality ladder at a particular price. And all respondents had to do in this particular case, for example, is indicate which of these future situations they preferred, or if they didn't want to pay, they could simply click, I prefer the reference situation. Nothing would then change, and they wouldn't pay then anything either. This is another way of us eliciting public willingness to pay. Here we included values or prices for water quality improvements in the lakes individually, and here people simply had to indicate which lake they wanted to see improved at a particular price. And then based on these choice experiments, we were able to estimate value functions, slightly different from the ones that I showed you before. And as I said, I don't have the time to go into a lot of detail of how these choice models and value functions look like, but we used state-of-the-art modeling, mixed logit models that account for differences in income, distance decay. So the further people live away from the lakes, the less they are on average willing to pay for the preservation of that lake, and public perception of baseline water quality levels. So because we presented them with some baseline or reference levels of water quality, but the question was, did that correspond with the respondents' own perception of that baseline water quality level? And so here you see the results of the surveys. So here are again these unit values that I showed you before, the dollars that households are willing to pay on an annual basis for the improvement of water quality, for the same change in water quality levels from the baseline to the policy targets that I showed you before. In black now you see the old values, and in red you see the values that came out of the survey. And you see that for Lake Superior we find values that are very similar to the ones that we found out of that Canadian valuation function, In the other cases, the values were significantly, substantially lower than what came out of that Canadian value function. If you compare, for example, Lake Ontario with Lake Huron, or even Lake Superior with Lake Huron, what seems to be the case is that lakes with higher water quality levels generate higher public willingness to pay. If you compare, for example, Lake Huron with Lake Ontario and Lake Superior with Lake Huron. But you have to keep in mind that there was a change in the baseline water quality level for Ontario from boatable to fishable that generated a substantially higher willingness to pay. And the same applies to Lake Huron. If we improve water quality levels in Lake Huron further to the same drinkable water quality level as Lake Superior, we have to add this additional amount of money on top of what is presented here in red. So I've come to the end of my presentation, and I have some conclusions here for you. So what we see is that the value of improved water quality has increased over time of the last 3 decades in Canada, controlling for a host of influencing factors like methodological advances, etc. The significant differences that we found initially in the univariate analysis between groundwater and surface waters, that somewhat disappears once we include control for these influencing factors. And what we see is that these existing transfer models seem to overestimate the non-market use values associated with water quality improvements in Canada. And in environmental economics, it's especially these use values that we typically assume to be easier to measure than non-use values, for example. But still, we see that there are big differences in the values depending on the method that we are using. And most likely that is due to a lack of a common water quality valuation framework in the underlying valuation studies. So this overestimation is based on studies that hardly used water quality ladders. And as I showed you and told you before, if you look at the difference in public willingness to pay of studies that use the water quality ladder and those that didn't use that water quality ladder, the former generated significantly lower willingness to pay values than the latter. So using a water quality ladder results in a significantly lower overall willingness to pay. So that is what I expect is going on. And the number of studies, this is a very open door conclusion number 5. Of course, we always want to do more research, but the fact that we have only 22 studies focusing on water quality in Canada, where we have so much water, but where the water quality is under serious pressure from different economic activities, is asking for more studies to test the transferability of these values using a common valuation design. There are a number of issues that we're trying to address in this project. We're only focusing on use values, as I mentioned, not on non-use values, but we're looking into ways of improving the existing or extending the existing water quality ladder by also including non-use values, for example, protection of aquatic life as defined in the Canadian Water Quality Index, the CCME Water Quality Index that was developed in 2000 or was published in 2001, and I think it was updated in 2017. What is crucial here to emphasize is that link between the values that we put on these ecosystem services to the underlying biophysical conditions in the water is crucial. So that pioneering work in the water quality valuation model is what we believe the way forward to make a strong case for investing in water quality improvements. But we will have to be able to show what these changes or improvements in water quality levels mean in terms of use and non-use values for society at large and public willingness to pay. The public that in the end is going to have to pay for these investments anyway, either directly or indirectly through income taxation or something like that. And work is going on to address the connectivity of the different water quality parameters that are being used in these water quality ladder to generate a more meaningful composite water quality index. And that's the work that is being done by the non-economists on this project. So basically, the next steps is further developing that water quality valuation model, making the values more reliable. We have a nice range of values now to show in which order of magnitude we have to think of these non-market values, but there's still quite a bit of work ahead of us, I think, given the low number of valuation studies in Canada. So that was it from my side. I took a little bit longer than I expected. We have time for questions. I'm going to stop sharing so you can see my face when I answer the questions. And as I mentioned, I'm going to moderate myself this time, so that's going to be a bit of a challenge. But Julie is helping me in the background once I've gone through the questions. So the first question is from Cynthia McLean, and she asks, do the estimates of social costs of freshwater pollution include groundwater pollution? If not, do you know of any work underway or drivers in Canada to incorporate groundwater quality into social costs? I don't really have the answer. So you're referring to the IISD report, I assume, because the study by Rob Smith is looking at surface water for Lake Erie. That I know, but I don't know if the IISD study also includes groundwater. I suspect not, and I also don't know of any work that is ongoing here in Canada to look at the social costs of groundwater quality specifically. The next one is anonymous. How do you quantify and compare the value of or price of water for different purposes or objectives? For example, for drinking water, for industrial purposes, for ecosystem services, for recreational, cultural, or religious purposes. So the principle in economics is fairly simple and the same. We really differ from other social sciences in the way we define value. We ideally look at actual market behavior and extract values from purchasing behavior of participants or consumers on a market. And what they are actually paying for goods and services is what we in economics consider the most reliable value of that good or service. So it doesn't suffice in economics to say, I like something, I think something is important, something is beautiful. We really want you to put your money where your mouth is. And hence the reason why we're working with willingness to pay. The values that we are using in this study are based on hypothetical willingness to pay. There are a number of people, I think, also on this call that are also looking at actually revealed preferences, as they're called, using different types of models. For example, for recreation, that's one of the categories in your question, to look at what people are actually spending to visit the Great Lakes, for example, and stay there. And so that will be another way of expressing the value from an economic point of view to the lakes or to the water. The next one is Adrienne Mason. How does the valuation of water relate to the declaration of water as a human right? Water itself does not have a value in and of itself at this time in Canada, just the fee for treatment and infrastructure for users. Many examples of impoverished communities having less access to drinkable water exist in Canada already. How could adding more costs to accessing clean water affect those who are already experiencing water scarcity? So this is a very good question and a very complicated. It is a very complicated issue because I agree with you that obviously access to clean, safe drinking water, I also personally believe that that is a human right. But as an economist, at the same time, I'm aware of the fact that if you supply water, that comes at a cost, and you need to think about sustainable financing mechanisms to ensure that that supply is not jeopardized and that you actually achieve water security as under the Sustainable Development Goal number 6. Julie is clicking away the things very quickly. So so it is a human right. As an economist, we're aware of the fact that even if it is a human right, it will come at a cost, and someone will have to pay for the cost. And there are different ways of doing that. The example that I always use in my own classes is that of Ireland, where water was supplied free of charge, so to say, for centuries until 2008, when the world went into a deep financial crisis, and the government of Ireland went more or less bankrupt, and they started charging people for everything to make sure that the government was able to continue to operate. And that included installing water meters in people's homes and making them pay for the amount of water that they were using. And so the argument was used that it is a human right, but people were actually, water wasn't for free. They were paying for water already. It just came indirectly through their income taxes, and they didn't pay for it directly. It doesn't solve any of the complex issues that you're raising with boiling advisories in Canada, etc., and ensuring that people in remote areas also have access to clean water. And I don't think I have the time to discuss with you in a lot of detail, of how all these different complexities should be handled. But it is a very important point, and that should definitely not be ignored. I'm going to the next one. If you don't mind, the anonymous attendee is another anonymous attendee. Can you identify jurisdictions or organizations that are, in your opinion, using water valuation practically and effectively in their decision-making processes? How is the public involved? So the water quality valuation model is an example of an attempt of helping policy and decision-making to get at some value for the benefits of improving water quality. So it's typically very easy to identify how much it will cost to improve water quality. But then the question is, you can spend your limited money resources perhaps on different water quality improvement projects. How do you choose between these different water quality improvement projects? And how do you pay for that? So how the public is involved in that, I don't know. So to what extent public consultation plays a role in these decision-making processes, I cannot tell. And I'm focusing primarily here on that technical tool that I showed you before. Rajendra Paudel, did you or your team think about Bayesian model to use because of the fact that you only have 22 study sites? I have a statistician looking at the data again at this moment to see if we can do something more with the predictive power by using part of the sample as a prior, and then use that prior to improve the prediction a posteriori based on that prior expectation, using just a subset of that total sample. So it is something that we are actually currently looking at. Thank you for the suggestion. John Livernoise, I think I missed this, but were your estimates of willingness to pay per household just for Canadian households or for both Canadian and US households for your service result? And those were just for the Canadian ones. So I didn't present the US ones. So if you Google Great Lakes Futures, that's another project in Global Water Futures, you can see the US values as well. So we tested the difference over time and between Canadian and US residents. The values that I showed you were just for the Canadian ones. Will you share the deck? I can put the deck on the website of the project if that's agreeable with you. And the session is also being recorded, and so the video will also be posted on that project website. Kayla B, Hi, do you consider the water that is in our air as an asset that can help elevate some of the water issues we have in Canada? No, I don't. I'm not sure if I fully understand what you're saying, but no, I'm not. It's really the water in the lakes and the rivers and under the ground. So that was talking myself through the different questions. If there are no more questions, then we're really nice in time for closing this first session. I hope it was informative. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating. If you have any follow-up questions, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm happy to continue the discussion offline. As I mentioned, there is a website, there is a project website that I can share with you if you're interested in keeping up to date with the work that is going on in that water resources valuation project that I referred to in the beginning. And I look forward to see you all again in a month's time. Julie, I think, just posted in the chat the link to the next presentation. It will be Professor Ji Hei from Sherbrooke University. And she does a lot of this kind of work as well. And she's going to talk about public preferences in Quebec for water quality improvements. So once again, thank you very much for your attendance, for your questions, for your participation in today's session. And I look forward to see you again in a month's time.